discussing a presentation today by a PhD student here at Stanford, and it's about optimization in the autonomous vehicle space. So there's two particular, well, there's one overarching problem. The overarching problem is how to act within the context of other agents acting. And the solution to that problem, according to this presentation, is twofold, or the presentation was about two approaches. One is optimal behavior through rationality assumption, and the other is counterfactual analysis. Now, I would say these are both kind of old-fashioned words for more modern problem-solving techniques. In particular, the second one, the counterfactual analysis, is what Gen AI promises to do, what people like Abil and others at Berkeley have already published in papers, which is you create, let's say you use video as a medium, and you create counterfactual scenarios of a particular action, and then you train a robot in sim to deal with those counterfactual analysis. I don't want to diminish this work. Of course, this is a PhD thesis, so it's very analytical and it's very deep academic, and there's probably a lot of work that has to be done here just to be formally correct and mathematically correct and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to go into details, and also this is by no means a judgment, but I'm going to critique and ask a few questions. This is not even on podcast. It's April 30th, 2024. This is Kremdelko. For the day, the fund is down 4.5%. The market's down 1%. For the year, we are down 24.7%. The market is up 7%. We're underperforming by 31.7%. We had a bit of a drawback today in the market, particularly Tesla, down 5.5%. I think there is still some erratic behavior by Elon Musk. He fired his whole supercharging team today, or a big chunk of it, which is a bit nerve-wracking, in particular because people weren't quite sure what's even wrong with that team. And as a user, we're very happy with the situation there. So we have to dig a little bit further, but it's just to say that there is still just a bunch of uncertainty around this situation, and that Tesla is just going to be a difficult way to make money with. But when you invest in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices, this is what happens. You deal with uncertainty, you deal with new situations, and fundamentally what Musk is doing is always the right way in terms of driving people to do their best. It's maybe not always the most human way, but from a getting stuff done perspective, it is certainly the best way. And yes, it's hard to fathom sometimes why things are done. And from the outside, we also don't have enough information to judge that properly. So we want to refrain from that. The thesis at Orange Capital Partner stays fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices. We're expecting a new transportation market with autonomous robots driving around as taxis or as own vehicles, driving down the cost per mile and cost per minute, and therefore increasing the demand for transportation, increasing the revenue potential, increasing the business potential, and Tesla being a central player in it. So now let's talk about this presentation. It's a PhD presentation. It's actually the first time I attend a PhD defense. It's an interesting part of the series of seminars here at Stanford, or generally at any university, because it implies not just theoretical research, but also it shows a little bit how this works. And just before I go in there, I want to say one thing. One thing I've learned today in this presentation is I have a feeling that the talent here, particularly in the Bay Area around Stanford, is very skewed towards Google. You can see it in the presentations. It's almost geared. You could almost argue that a PhD is a 4-year application mechanism to be hired by Google. Things like, they're using the data sets of Google, they're using papers, citing papers of Google. So it's a little bit of an incestual academic environment here. And that's part of the reason why we believe that the advancements are just very pedestrian, as opposed to Tesla, which is driving full self-drive to almost to its conclusion, and it's just much faster, much more effective. Disappointing today in the presentation that there's no mention of the Tesla full self-drive. In fact, the only example that he showed in terms of accidents was a Tesla in an accident. The accident itself was the kind of accident that anybody would have been part of. It's just that the propaganda, the tacit or explicit propaganda that is prevalent here at Stanford against Tesla is just mind-boggling, and it's disappointing because there could be much more collaboration. There could be much more. What's the word? Fruitful critique and competition. And because of the monopoly money of Google and Meta as a sort of second-tier AI place to work for here, those two places are monopolizing the talent. The talent doesn't really want to deal with deadlines and the hard push that they're exposed to at a place like Tesla. So they choose to go the sort of the honey jar way in Google and Meta. And the PhDs are almost, like I said, it almost sounds like an application process to get a job there. So instead of saying, look, these are the methods that we use today, but they're outdated. We have much better methods. We can be much faster. We have good examples of a situation like, for example, the full self-drive 12.3 and 12.6 now the latest. We can change some of our assumptions. We can be more aggressive. We can do this. We can do that. Instead, they're sort of falling back on almost DARPA level 2005-6 type methodologies that are just outdated. So, but anyway, that's just an observation. Now let's talk about the presentation. With again, all the respect, and like I said, this is an academic work. This is a PhD, and sometimes PhDs are a little bit more involved than they should be. Maybe they are not as practical. Maybe they don't have the kind of return on investment and in time that you would expect from like an employee at Tesla. And again, it's research, so maybe there's some ideas that can be used for further application. So there's two aspects to this work. One is behavioral planning on the assumption of rationality. This, to me, reminds me of my days as an economist, undergrad at Zurich and then master's at Chicago. The rationality assumption is certainly a useful one. It's like the efficient market hypothesis. You can start with that. You can build a model on that, and then you can model around you can use this as a baseline, and then have all the other occurrences which are inevitably going to happen, and count them as the non-rational part of the decision-making process, and then model that. Like last week when I discussed the presentation from Caltech, which dealt with this in the decision-making process of humans. Now back to this presentation here. We're talking about traffic scenarios, and we're talking specifically about one traffic scenario in an experiment where they took videos of a roundabout, and people were driving through that roundabout with speed, and they were modeling the decision-making of agents. Now, as a tangent, I see a Moravec paradox here, which is the hard things are easy and the easy things are hard. So, for example, the multi-lane high-speed merge highway stuff, it seems to be solved by FSD or robotics in general by through end-to-end training and camera sensors, because in my opinion, there's two things to that. One is the sensors are much better at actually gauging what's going on, and then second, actually you have very little degrees of freedom when you're in a high-speed scenario, because you just don't have that many options. You can go straight, you can go left, right, depending on the lanes, but they're just you can't do a U-turn, you can't do a lot of things that cars could potentially do. So your action space is very limited. However, the easy stuff is hard. Like if I'm on Highway 1 and a car turns to the curb and unexpectedly my Tesla will go around the car, but it will not anticipate that maybe the people in the car, they might be sick, or they might be tourists, they just want to take pictures, so they open the door. They're not used to traffic in the US or whatever, and it's just, so what you want to do as a human, you want to maybe just slow down a bit and maybe go, try to make a little bit of a bigger detour around the car. That's what I would do, just to be safe. And I don't think FSD is not able to do that. So those are sort of, I would say, the easy things. That's kind of common sense stuff. Now, I believe that rationality approaches could work here, but one has to ask a fundamental question here. Can this not all be solved with large language models? Because the semantics and the logic and the common sense that large language models have through the knowledge of the internet, that they're compressed, that it's compressed in LLMs, it might be enough to actually solve those problems. But again, rationality approaches are useful as a baseline, and then we have to find ways to model all the other stuff. And I believe there's two scenarios that I see. One is the large language model stuff. The other is the transformer stuff, which is the transformer stuff being that you model the world and what's possible, and then you do statistical inference, variational inference, where you don't know exactly what the distribution of possible outcomes is, but you kind of approach a possibility. In the case, let's say, in the case I just mentioned, where you're driving on Highway 1 and then there's a car that feels like a rental car, drives like a rental car, and it stops on the curb in the middle of the road, and you expect that car to do something unexpected, i.e., in particular, maybe open the door, which on Highway 1 can be tricky because it's a narrow highway. It's just a two-lane highway. So you just want to slow down a bit. You want to anticipate these types of behaviors. In this particular presentation, they're using rational behavior, and that reminds me of the efficient market hypothesis. Again, I'm not against these types of things. I'm in the financial markets myself. Been in my financial markets for 30 years. I've been able to make a living. So clearly, efficient market hypothesis is not a deal breaker for people to act in the markets. It's just it's a good baseline to work with, for example, for pricing, for baseline stuff, and then you go from there. Now, the next thing I wanted to discuss in the context of this presentation is what they call counterfactual decision making. And that, to me, it's a little bit outdated, because what they're really doing here is what Gen AI is doing today. It's generate samples of real traffic-based scenarios, and then generate counterfactual samples. So again, we have, let's say, a car driving on Highway 1, and we want to have multiple samples of that car, maybe stopping, breaking down, turning to the curb, opening the door, children running out of the car, dogs running out of the car. You want to have all these things and then train them in simulation. I think this type of work is interesting. Maybe it's a bit outdated in the way the techniques are being applied, but it's certainly useful. That we believe, and this goes back to Dieter Fox. I'm going to discuss Dieter Fox in more detail, his presentation he recently gave at CMU, but I think that's also where NVIDIA is going, and I'll be curious to know where Tesla stands in that front. So to summarize this PhD presentation that I attended today at Stanford, interesting from various perspectives. One is the approach that academia is taking towards the uncertainty of self-driving. In particular, the modeling of behavior, and in this case, they're using rational behavior models, which are good as a baseline. But then you have to find ways to model the actual the part which is not rational, which is really the interesting part if you think about it. And that, in our opinion, can be done now with large language models and or transformers. And then the second part was sort of the counterfactual analysis, which is sort of the Gen AI part. Like, how can we generate samples of traffic scenarios based on real-world scenarios that then can be used in sim for further analysis, in particular, sort of the edge cases. We can generate lots of edge cases. In theory, we can have many, many billions versions of Highway 1, billions of versions of Highway 101, and so on and so forth, with rain and ice and airplanes landing on it. And we can train an agent based on model-based or even model-free reinforcement learning, ideally model-free on-policy reinforcement learning. In sim, you could do that, and then translate from sim to real. Thank you.